Okay, today we're looking at 2.8, or solving linear inequalities. And so we've worked in chapter 2 about solving linear equations. And so now we're going to use those same 6 steps that we've been working on all along. It's just now we're going to have inequalities and we're going to solve graph and write them in interval notation. So let's first look at how you graph an inequality. So this first one it's actually read as, instead of x equals 5, like we've been coming up with answers like that in the past, we've got x is greater than 5. And so to graph that, you're going to draw a number line and you're going to mark your 5. I didn't leave much room here, but for less than and greater than, we're going to use parentheses, and less than and greater than, less than and equal to, greater than or equal to, we're going to use brackets. In high school, you might have used open circles and closed circles, and if you graph it that way, that's perfectly okay. But we're going to write them in interval notation, so if we get in the habit of writing them as parentheses and brackets, it just all kind of works into the interval notation. And so I just kind of think of visually, if you kind of use your imagination, that the parentheses, the less than and greater than are a lot like parentheses, and the less than or equal to make these brackets, because you can kind of think of those as being equal signs. So if it's going to actually equal that, you make it a bracket. So when I go to graph 5, because it's just a greater than, it's going to be a parentheses at 5 and shaded to the left. So because it's a less than or greater than, it's a parentheses. And then you want to think about this greater than is going to go the same way as that end sign. If it's pointing the other way, you're going to go to the left, but it's pointing to the right, so you're going to shade to the way it points. Kind of think of that as an arrow pointing to the right, telling you need to shade it that way. And so that's our graph for x is greater than 5. And then interval notation comes straight from this graph. So let's think about when we have a number line. When we head off forever to the right, we head off into positive infinity. But when we continue on in the left, we continue on into negative infinity. So when you're reading interval notation, you're thinking, okay, there's nothing on the graph here, but it starts at 5 and goes on into infinity. So the interval notation comes straight from the graph, so that's going to be a parentheses 5, and it's going to continue out into infinity. It just comes straight from that graph. So this next one, to graph it, it's a less than or equal to, so it's going to be a bracket at 5. And you see how this time it's pointing that way? Think of this is going to line up with this, and that's the way you're going to shade. So x is less than or equal to 5 goes the other way. And now when you're following it from left to right, you're coming from negative infinity to 5 and then stopping. And so that's our interval notation. For x is less than 5, because of the less than, that's going to be a parentheses at 5. And again, it's pointing to the left, so we're going to shade to the left. And interval notation is negative infinity to 5 parentheses. And then the last one, x is greater than or equal to 5, is a bracket at 5 shaded to the right, because again, it's pointing to the right. And interval notation is bracket 5 to infinity. You read it left to right. So this one's coming from negative infinity and stops at 5. This one doesn't start until 5, and it goes on to infinity. So that's an example of each type of graph that you'll have. And so now the actual problems you're going to have on the assignment tell you, we'll come back to what's in red, but you want to solve it, graph it, and write an interval notation. And so we're going to follow our 6 steps just like we've been doing before. The only thing that's different is if you divide by a negative, you flip the symbol, and you don't divide until step 6. So in the last step, if you're dividing by negative, you're going to flip the symbol. Otherwise, you're going to leave it just like it is. So let's look at some different examples. So this first one, we need to solve it. Just think of your inequality as the same thing as where an equal sign is. And so we're going to look at this one and say, Step 1, there's no fractions. Step 2, there's no parentheses. Step 3, there's nothing to simplify on each side. But step 4 is I need to move the letter to the left. And remember, when you go over the equal sign, you do the opposite. So this is like a 1k, so I'm going to minus a 1k, minus a 1k, which is going to give me a k plus 3 is greater than or equal to 8. And then step 5, move your number to the right. So I'm going to minus a 3, which leaves me k is greater than or equal to 5, because 8 minus 3 is 5. So I solved it. Now I need to graph it, and actually that one worked out the same as those up there. But so greater than or equal to is a bracket at 5 shaded to the right, and interval notation is bracket 5 to infinity. And so for all of these, you're going to have 3 answers. You solved it, graphed it, and you wrote it in interval notation. And these all mean exactly the same thing. It's just different ways of writing it. Okay, let's look at this next one. So again, I'm following my 6 steps. There's no fractions, there's no parentheses, there's nothing to simplify. My letter's already on the left. So all I have to do is step 5, which is move my number to the right, which gives me a negative 5x is less than 10. And then right here is where, when we get to step 6, we're dividing by a negative. And so when you divide by a negative, you have to flip this symbol. So that's going to leave me x is less than negative 2. So before we go on from there, I didn't leave myself a lot of room, but let's look at it down here. I want to show you why you flip the symbol. So if I said 8 is greater than 6, everybody, I think, would agree that that's the truth. And if I divide by a positive 2, I end up with 4 is greater than 3. Still a true statement. So when you divide by a positive, nothing changes. But what if I have the same problem, 8 is greater than 6, and I divide by negative 2? When you divide by negative 2, I get a negative 4 is less than a negative 3. And that's not a true statement. Negative 4 is greater than negative 3. So when you divide by a negative, it's like it negates the whole inequality sign. It flips it the other way because of those negatives. So when you divide by a positive, nothing changes. It's only when you divide by that negative. So right here, we divided by a negative, so we had to flip the symbol. So just remember, and it doesn't happen except for in step 6, that when you divide by a negative, you flip the symbol. So here we're going to draw our, so we solved it. Now we're going to graph it. That's a parentheses at negative 2, shaded to the left. And interval notation is negative infinity to negative 2 parentheses. So there's your answers. Okay, this next one's a little bit more complicated, but we're just going to follow our steps. Step 1, does it have any fractions? No. Step 2, get rid of the parentheses. So 5 times x is 5x. 5 times negative 3 is negative 15. And then minus 7x greater than or equal to 4x minus 12 plus 9. Got rid of my parentheses. Then remember step 3, be aware of your equal sign. Let me do this in green. It's all the way over here. So your equal sign and your inequality is the same thing. And so combine like terms. So I can say 5x minus 7x is a negative 2x. Bring down the minus 15. Greater than or equal to. Over here, I can add my numbers. So the 4x comes down. And negative 12 plus 9 is negative 3. Then we're going to do step 4, which is move your letter to the left. So I'm going to minus a 4x minus a 4x, which gives me a negative 6x minus 15 is greater than or equal to negative 3. So I went letter to the left. Now I'm going to go number to the right. So I'm going to plus a 15. So negative 6x is greater than or equal to 12. And then right here in step 6, I'm dividing by a negative. So I have to flip that symbol and get x is less than or equal to negative 2. So I solved it. I didn't leave myself enough room here. Let me write this in blue. So x is less than or equal to negative 2. So I'll graph it over here. So the graph is a bracket at negative 2, shaded to the left. And interval notation is negative infinity to negative 2 bracket. So 3 answers on that one. Okay, let's look at this next one. Surely the first thing you see is fractions. We hate those fractions, but that's okay. We're going to get rid of them in step 1. So as soon as you see a fraction, we're going to look at these denominators, 3, 2, and 2, and we're going to multiply everything except the parentheses by the common denominator. So the common denominator of 3 and 2 is 6. So just remember, if you don't know what it is, you're looking for what multiple they have in common. My multiples of 3 are 3, 6, and 9. My multiples of 2 are 2, 4, and 6. What's the first one they have in common? 6. So we're going to multiply everything by 6 except for the parentheses. So here, remember, you're multiplying the top by the 6 and then you're dividing by the 3. So 6 times 2 is 12. 12 divided by 3 is 4. Bring down the parentheses. Remember, you do everything except the parentheses. It's like they're protected. And then a minus. 6 times 1 is 6. Divided by 2 is 3. The less than comes down. 6 times 1 is 6. Divided by 2 is 3. Bring down the parentheses. So step 1, we got rid of our fraction. Step 2, get rid of the parentheses. So 4 times x is 4x. 4 times 3 is negative 12. Bring down the minus 3, the less than. 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times negative x is negative x. Step 3, be aware of your equal sign and combine like terms. So this would be a 4x minus 15 is less than 15 minus 3x. Step 4, move your letter to the left, and when you go over the equal, you do the opposite. So I'm going to add a 3x. Giving me a 7x minus 15 is less than 15. Then I'm going to take my number to the right, so I'm going to do the opposite, add a 15, and get 7x is less than 30. And then step 6 is divide by the number in front, but because it's positive, we don't have to change it. And 7 won't go into 30, so we just leave it the fraction 30 over 7. So we solved it. Let's mark this out. We solved it. And then to graph a fraction, you're just going to do a parentheses at 30 over 7. And it's shaded to the left because that's the way it's pointing. And then interval notation is negative infinity to 30 over 7. So those are your 3 answers. Okay, and then these last 2 are kind of special cases. They're called compound inequalities because they have 2 inequalities there. So when you read this, you're really saying negative 3 is less than x, which is less than 5. But you can really think about it as just saying x is in between negative 3 and 5. So if I ask what numbers are between negative 3 and 5, I think you'd have no trouble saying negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But in graph form, to graph it, you just mark this is a less than, so that's a parentheses at negative 3, a parentheses at 5, and it's everything in between. X is between negative 3 and 5. And then interval notation comes straight from that, just parentheses negative 3 to 5. And that's your answer. But this next one is not solved for x. Remember, you can't graph it until x is by itself. X is not by itself here. So following our steps, if you just ignored this over here, you've got your letter on your left. You'd want to move your number to the right by adding a 5. So you're going to do the same thing. You just have to do it to both sides. You have to do it over there also. So because I want to get x by itself and I need to add 5, I'm going to add it to both sides, which cancels it out there. It makes this 9 is less than 3x is less than or equal to 15. But x is still not by itself, so I have to divide by 3. So I have to do everything by 3. So I end up with 3 is less than x is less than or equal to 5. Oh, that came out the same numbers. I just made that up. But for this one, it's going to be a parentheses at 3 and a bracket at 5 this time because of that less than or equal to, and shade everything in between. And so that's parentheses 3 to 5 bracket. And so that's 2.8. You're now ready to